Last week, the FCC issued a news release and a statement proposing a $34,000 fine to a radio amateur who was transmitting to support fire suppression aircraft missions, he says. The FCC says that he interfered. We're going to take a look at this from the perspective of emergency communicators. Stick around.
Black Swan, Black Swan.
Many radio operators who prepare for emergency communications will program frequencies into their radios just in case. Sometimes this includes frequencies that are outside of their normal operating privileges. Someone did that, used it, and is now looking at a $34,000 fine. Today's video is based on an active regulatory action, and developments may still come. I'm not going to tell you what is okay, but we will talk about the problem. We're going to give you things to think about as you prepare for communicating in emergencies. If you take anything away from this video, make sure that it is to know the limits of your expertise. There is also a corollary, and that is to know the difference between what you can do and what you may do. Before we get into the facts of this case, let me tell you about some of my experience and some of the expertise that I do and do not have. First of all, I am not an attorney, and I am not proffering legal opinion or advice. People sometimes will see how I read and use regulation and assume that I am an expert in law. I am not an expert in law. I am an expert in computer science and technology and have been qualified to offer expert opinions in courts throughout the United States. This distinction of expertise in law, as opposed to a technical or scientific discipline, is important. Obviously, I also have expertise in radio. In addition to my professional work that is used in a legal context, my experience that's relevant includes use of amateur radio and other radio services as an authorized user throughout the United States and its possessions. I also have particular experience in interoperability, as we show on some of the Black Swan and 5 MHz interoperability videos on this channel. The FCC announced on June 8, 2022 that it was proposing a $34,000 fine on amateur radio licensee Jason Frawley. The announcement sets forth the Commission's finding of facts, their investigation, and their rationale for the notice of apparent liability wherein they propose this fine. At the time of this video, we have not seen a response from Mr. Frawley, so we're going to be just trying to look at things as presented by the Commission, and we're going to try and view it objectively. We are using this issue to get an understanding of guidance that we could use as we are planning our own emergency communications. The FCC, in its announcement, leads with rationale for its fine. Number one is interfering with radio communication guiding fire suppression aircraft. Number two, the U.S. Forest Service and the Idaho Department of Lands were fighting a wildfire actively. And number three, interference with public safety communication. So what was the situation in particular? Well, we did have crews from the Forest Service and Idaho Department of Lands actively engaged in fighting a wildfire and using radio communications to coordinate. The Forest Service received 8 transmissions on a government frequency. The operator identified himself as ComTech and communicated his observations of hazards near the Elk Butte airstrip. Mr. Frawley reportedly confirmed that he made the transmissions as ComTech, at least some of them. The Forest Service made a complaint to the FCC. The FCC initiated an investigation. The FCC didn't indicate any attempt by Mr. Frawley to deceive or to conceal information about his operation. They noted that he stated his intent to provide assistance with specific details of the operation in progress. They also noted that he did say that somebody else might have been transmitting at the same time because he did cease operation at some point, and they were not very clear about the details there. The FCC asserts that the transmissions did interfere, but they didn't say how, except maybe by diversion of resources trying to find where the unauthorized transmissions were coming from. Mr. Frawley responded to a letter of inquiry that he was just trying to give them information, trying to aid the operation. FCC Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel issued a statement along with the public news release. She identified Mr. Frawley as a radio amateur, but not as a commercial licensee, which is also true. She claims that public safety communication efforts were thwarted by the unauthorized transmissions. She focused on interference. She noted that it was willful, the intention to operate there, and that the intent to help wasn't relevant. She noted that there were repeated transmissions, and that was based on Mr. Frawley's own statements. First of all, the transmissions took place on a part of the spectrum that is not covered by amateur radio. Amateurs simply are not authorized to transmit on that frequency. Nevertheless, we're going to look at some of the operation within amateur radio because the FCC specifically pointed out that Mr. Frawley is a radio amateur. We're going to look at how amateur radio operations in emergencies or in preparation for emergencies may also create some bad expectations on the part of radio amateurs who mean to be helpful. 47 CFR 97.1. That's Title 47 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 97.1A is the definition of emergency communications utility in amateur radio. We discussed that specifically on episode 42 of this channel. That is the recognition and enhancement of the value of the amateur service to the public as a voluntary non-commercial communication service, particularly with respect to providing emergency communications. Amateur radio, even emergency services like Aries and Skywarn, often run as open nets. Anyone with relevant information is welcome to report into the net. An individual then will self-judge whether their transmission would be helpful and on that basis decides whether to enter the net. Operators using poor practice are rarely corrected well in amateur radio. On the one hand, there's overreaction that impugns the intention or even the intelligence of the operator, and on the other hand, we sometimes have underreaction for fear of hurting someone's feelings by telling them the right way to do something. And this might well set the stage for unwise operation that can be later deemed unlawful. Now, isn't there an exception for protecting life and property? Well, there is an exception, but it's not blanket. It doesn't throw all of the rules out the window. We'll take a look at 47 CFR 97.403, and we're going to look at that very carefully to see what is it exactly that we're talking about when we get into the justification of a transmission based on life, safety, or the protection of property. Looking at Paragraph 97.403. Some people will focus on the first part, finding the words "by any means of radio communication at its disposal," and then safety of human life and protection of property. Let's look more closely at some critical details. First of all, these phrases are qualified. It's limited to essential communication needs. On someone else's operation, it's what they think is essential, not what you think is essential. The protection of life and property is immediate. That looks to me like we're talking about distress in the moment, not a general emergency condition. Finally, when normal communications are unavailable is part of that paragraph. Seen this way, we can focus on very different elements of the specification from what some other people might focus on. Going a step further, we can go back to the very beginning where it says that nothing prevents. It doesn't impose any duty or requirement to transmit. Ultimately, the difference may come down to whether you're looking for a justification for making a transmission on a net that you normally would not, or if you are left with making a transmission as the least bad option available to address an immediate threat to human life and property. So what do we do? It's a reasonable question. What do we do if we have information that will help an emergency operation? First of all, the question we should ask ourselves is if we do in fact have specific actionable information that they don't have. And if so, is it essential? And if it is, are other communication systems unavailable? The normal means of communication. If they are available, then that means we don't need to make that transmission. The facts of this case, as they're set forth by the Commission, don't indicate any kind of failure of regular communications. As far as we know, the phone worked. So why not pick up the phone and call the Forest Service or call the Department of Lands if you have specific actionable information? So what is the impact? Well, we don't know why the Commission decided to single out the fact that Mr. Frawley is an amateur radio licensee. He is a licensee of other services as well. We can speculate, but it won't help. As it is, the Commission has now made a release and proposed a record fine for this type of transmission, and it's going to get attention. This is going to be cited by some emergency managers and others who might want to avoid working with amateur operators. Some might see the Commission's analysis and proposal as an overreaction. After all, he says he was only trying to help. Trying to hurt might increase the level of culpability that somebody has, but intentionally operating beyond the scope of authorization is still intentional. It's interesting to note that the Commission does not propose surrendering of any license. Now, I can tell you that when I'm operating an incident, it's a closed net. I do not welcome random transmissions. This has happened even when I was an agency operator on a public safety radio net. I had somebody else report into the talk group. That's something I report to the spectrum manager. It does get chased down. So a couple of takeaways. Know your limits. Stay within the scope of your authorization. Do not assume that because you can do something, you may. Engineering knowledge does not necessarily make you an expert in law or regulation. In fact, it's my experience that they don't often go together. 4 is that if you want to serve your community, then become part of a system, whether it's an NGO or an agency, and do so before there is an emergency or a disaster, as we discussed in episode 42. As I said in the beginning, this is a developing situation, and we have not seen Mr. Frawley's response. The proposal is just that. It is a proposal, a notice of apparent liability. However this turns out, it is very unfortunate, and amateur radio operators are going to suffer damage to image as a consequence. Amateur operators must take care not to be seen as cowboys or kooks. Keep doing good work. In the meantime, keep training, keep operating well, demonstrate trustworthiness and viability. It's the only way we're going to be able to overcome obstacles like this. Share this video if you found it helpful, like it, subscribe to the channel to avoid missing any new stuff. 7-3, this is Radio KD8TTE, out.